especially thank you to the Dementia Caregivers program for inviting me to this speaker series. So my name is Julie Norstrand, and today's focus is going to be on the emotional dimensions of caregiving. Now, throughout my work consulting with families about planning for caregiving, as well as the work that I've done through the caregiver support groups, I've come to realize that caregiving is a very emotional journey, both rewarding and challenging. The rewarding aspects come from the time spent together with your loved one, which often results in getting to know much more about their history, as well as who they are today. It can also be a time for making amends and clarifying any misunderstandings that may have existed for years. But there are also many challenges that caregivers experience, and it's these challenges that I'm going to be focusing on today. I think it's both important and helpful for people who take on the role to be aware of possible challenges so that they're better prepared for how to deal with them. Now, I have given this presentation now in many different settings in the community. However, this one that I have made sure to really key in on the emotional challenges faced by those helping a loved one with dementia. And even though caregiving can be looked at in terms of the stage of life when you're caring for someone or the length of time of caregiving, but certainly the person for whom you're providing the care for is a major factor. And caring for a loved one with memory impairment is unique because of the element of the long goodbye. You're inevitably experiencing an ambiguous loss, and I will be discussing this as it is an important factor for the dementia caregiver. Now, on this slide here, you'll see different emotional challenges that many caregivers will describe. And as you're looking through these challenges, these emotional challenges, I wonder which ones that you recognize in yourself. So as I'm reading them out, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on them as I speak. So you have ambivalence, anger, anxiety, boredom, crankiness, irritability, depression, sadness, disgust, embarrassment, fear, frustration, grief, guilt, impatience, jealousy, lack of appreciation, loss, loneliness, resentment, utter fatigue. Now, as I said in the introduction, I've added details to this presentation so that it is geared specifically towards dementia caregivers. And these last two ones, denial and the long goodbye, are new ones. And I wonder, and I'm hoping later on after my presentation, we can talk a little bit more about these emotional challenges. I wonder if these last two really strike a chord with you. I would say that especially in the beginning, there can be a strong reaction in the form of denial. You don't want to believe or accept the diagnosis of dementia. You might feel that it just can't be true. Their memory loss is due to something else. They're tired, they're preoccupied, they're sick, but not dementia. It can be such a hard diagnosis to accept. And another emotional challenge experienced by dementia caregivers is the long goodbye, also described as ambiguous loss or anticipatory grief. And it's a really prominent one for dementia caregivers. And the term describes that prolonged sense of multiple losses, which can come in stages as your loved one's disease progresses. and again, a very tough one to cope with. I've heard a lot of these different emotions expressed by caregivers over the years. And some time ago, a caregiver wrote to me about how he was coping. He was someone who was caring for his wife who had Alzheimer's. And what he wrote to me was frustration, anxiety, anger, sleep deprivation, restricted activities, separation from friends. When it comes to understanding these emotions, it is important to realize that many of these emotions can come tied together. So case in point, some time ago when I was running a caregiver support group, we were talking about how the caregivers were coping emotionally. And one of the things I noticed was that many of them talked about this idea of, feeling that they often lost patience with their loved one and then immediately feeling guilty. So I think you often see many of these emotions tied together. It's also important to realize that people may experience some of these emotions at different stages of caregiving. And indeed, these emotions can be especially strong for caregivers who are caring all alone, as it is much more challenging when you're doing this all on your own. So for the remainder of our time, what I'm going to be focusing on is first, what does it mean to become a caregiver? Then I'll address caregiver stress syndrome. I'll hone in on what different emotional stresses that caregivers typically experience. Then, very importantly, how can we manage our stress? And I'm hoping I'll be able to give you some potentially new ideas. I'll talk a little bit about services and resources for caregivers. And then finally, the last slide, I'm hoping I can help you get to a better place. So in other words, helping you to really set your goals. So what I've found is that one of the challenges in this line of work when trying to help caregivers is that often people don't define themselves as a caregiver. And this is especially true in the early stages of caregiving, where instead you see yourself as maybe the dutiful son or daughter or loving spouse. You're doing some food shopping, you're fixing a loose doorknob, you're reminding them of going to the doctor's appointment the next week. But eventually you're more than that dutiful son, daughter, or spouse. You become the one that your parent or your loved one relies on. In other words, you are their caregiver. And it's this reliance which is so critical in the relationship. And often this comes with challenges, stress, and time taken away from other responsibilities, including work, family, and social life. So again, as I'm talking about this, I'm wondering where you put yourself. I'm guessing some of you have been doing this for some time and clearly see yourself as a caregiver. However, some of you may be quite new. And the reason why this is important to think about is that if you don't really see yourself as a caregiver yet, you're probably not going to be paying attention to the resources out there. It's once you really see yourself as the caregiver, that's when you make use of resources. So the quicker you can help yourself label yourself as a caregiver, the more likely you'll start paying attention to the resources out there in the community. Now, a huge issue for caregivers is caregiver stress syndrome, also known as burnout. Now, there's a caregiver that truly exemplifies what caregiver burnout is all about, and is someone I will never forget. This was in the early, I think it was 2021, and this person reached out to me by phone out of the blue one evening. I remember it was fairly late. It was about 8:30, 9 o'clock. And she quickly just went straight into telling me what was going on in her life. She was someone who was living with her parents, both aged 91. She was the sole caregiver. Siblings were not available. She was burning through her retirement fund. The parents were very recluse and wouldn't let anyone but her take care of them. And she hadn't slept in days. And she was clearly burned out and experiencing multiple stresses. And I remember at the end of our call, I remember her thanking me so much. And really, it was just for listening. She really needed someone to talk to and really hear her. And I also remember thinking to myself, how many other thousands of caregivers are in a similar situation to her? And sadly, I think there are way too many. So one ask I have of those of you who may know of someone who's really in a very difficult situation as a caregiver, please reach out to them and let them know that you're there to provide them some support. Now, the way that caregiver stress syndrome can manifest itself is in terms of extreme exhaustion, and that can be experienced physically, mentally, emotionally, and socially. And on this slide here, you see some of the typical ways that burnout can manifest itself. So as you read through this list, you'll notice that some of these signs are more of physical nature, such as change in appetite and weight. Some are more emotional, such as irritability or sadness. Some have true social impacts, such as staying away from friends, isolating yourself, stopping doing the things that you love doing. Again, I think it will be helpful for you to reflect on maybe one or two that you really can identify in yourself, and which ones are these. So as you can well imagine, the more stressed out you are as a caregiver, the greater the toll on your health. So various studies have been done looking at stress and health outcomes in caregivers. And a meta-analysis has found that about somewhere between 40 to 70% of caregivers will endorse some level of depression. Another study looking at the health outcomes has indicated that roughly half of caregivers report some chronic conditions. And as you see from the list here, it can be quite varied. And this is just a small overview of the different types of health outcomes that stressed out caregivers will experience. One study looked at caregivers versus non-caregivers of the same age, and they found that those who were caregivers had a 63% higher mortality rate than non-caregivers when they were aged between 66 and 96. And again, let me tell you a quick story about one of my experiences in my work, and that was a family that I consulted with. They reached out to me because the person who had been the primary caregiver had attempted suicide. It was an absolute shock to everyone, and they all acknowledged that the suicide attempt was a clear cry for help. The stress had gotten so great that the only option for this caregiver, it seemed, was to attempt suicide. So if you're asking yourself why you should be concerned about stress, I hope some of these figures and my story really spells it out. You do need to pay attention to your stress level. So on this slide here, I've created some questions which I think are helpful in terms of getting a sort of a sense of where you are at. So the first one is, how anxious or stressed are you about expecting to become or being a caregiver? So from 0 to 100, with 100 being the most. So here you would say, I am at, and then whatever number that you would give yourself in terms of your stress level. The second question is, what is causing my anxiety? I am worried about. And here, try to be as specific as possible. And then the last question is, what are you doing to relieve your stress? In order to de-stress, and then you come up with what you find that you're currently doing. And I find that this is a good exercise, firstly, because it helps you to acknowledge the stress level that you're under by quantifying it. Second, it also gets you to really think about what are the triggers that relate to your stress around caregiving. And as I said, try again to be as specific as possible about what gets that stress reaction in you. And then the last one is when you're thinking about methods that you're using to de-stress. And here I think it can sometimes be helpful to be a little bit honest with yourself, in that sometimes we don't always use the best de-stressing methods. For example, sometimes people find that they're eating more than they should be, drinking more than they should be, isolating themselves more than they should be. That might be helpful in the very short moment, but in the long term, it doesn't help you. So here, what I hope as later on, when we talk about ways of de-stressing, I'm hoping we can come up with some better ways of reducing your stress level. Now, as I was just saying, it's really helpful to understand what is causing your stress. What are your triggers? So here on this slide, you see many of the stresses that caregivers report. Some reflect more early on stress, such as what is making the person worried in the beginning. And often this can be around, oh my God, I have no plan in place, or not knowing where to start. Also, people have reported to me that they had no idea where to turn to in order to get reliable information about planning around elder care. And also, not knowing how to start the conversation can be a huge stumbling block for many. Also, caregivers stress about how they're going to manage everything, especially if they have a family with children and are working. The work-life balance can be extremely difficult to handle, as the caregiver often feels that they're being pulled in so many different directions. Self-doubt is also another critical area. And for many, if they're suddenly having to manage chronic health conditions, along with typical caregiving duties as food shopping, taking the loved one to the doctor's appointment, doing the bills and taxes, preparing meals, and so on, this can all feel very daunting. And recently I consulted with 3 siblings, a sister and 2 brothers. And it was apparent that the sister was going to be doing the primary caregiving, the hands-on caregiving. And she was going to be living with the mom. And the 2 brothers lived fairly close by, and they would be on standby. And in our conversation, I immediately sensed extreme anxiety and stress in the sister. And it became apparent that she really felt tremendous self-doubt as to how she was going to take on this role. She'd never managed any sort of medical care. Also, she was worried about what if in the middle of the night that her mom needed to go to the restroom, the bathroom, how was she going to help her take her mom to the toilet? Also, what would happen if the mom fell? Would she be able to physically be able to pick her up. So when you think about her scenario, it's not difficult to understand why this felt so scary for her. I would say lack of support is probably one of the biggest chronic scenarios that result in caregiver burnout. There are too many caregivers out there who are doing the caregiving on their own, and the monotony of caregiving can be grinding. Unlike with childcare, where generally you see continued growth, here the caregiver is dealing with someone who is physically and mentally deteriorating. And unfortunately, that lack of support is reflective of the fact that we're having smaller families and also that we are living further apart. And finally, the inability for many families to afford paid care. Another area of stress is general family conflicts that occur due to disagreements about how the care should be done, who should be providing additional support beyond the primary caregiver, what the care recipient wants, or what is in their best interest. And I'm going to actually, in the next slide, talk about family conflicts in a bit more detail because I find this is a question that really brings on emotional stress for so many people. One other area is financial worries. Many caregivers find that they're paying for additional services or medications or possibly the mortgage for a parent or a loved one. They're finding that they're having to pay far more than they expected out of pocket. And if they themselves are struggling with their own finances, this can certainly be stressful. And indeed, AARP back in 2021 indicated that they found that on average, people were paying a little over $7,000 out of pocket per year. That was back in 2021. So that number has certainly gone up since then. Finally, challenging behavioral symptoms in dementia can include such as agitation, aggression, anxiety, depression, delusions, hallucinations, and sleep disturbances. And these are all very difficult to manage and impact not only the individual themselves, but certainly also the caregiver. And this definitely causes a lot of stress. So as I said, family conflict can be a huge issue. And the disagreements can be around, for example, often I've heard people trying to figure out, is now the time when the loved one should go to, for example, assisted living or memory care. Also, as I indicated, who should be providing more support. There are lots of typical disputes that happen in families. And just so you know, it is not unusual. Disagreements between family members can often occur because each adult child or family member may have a different understanding of the situation. And this can be based on the fact that we all have different relationships with our family members. So this means that we end up having different viewpoints and ways of thinking how things should be done. And it's for this reason that I always encourage the parent or spouse who's looking for support from family members to communicate their needs and wishes to all those who may be involved in the care plan at the same time so that everyone receives the same message. It can also be helpful when you sense ongoing challenges with family members to pinpoint exactly where the disagreements might be and to figure out how to work through these different points of view. Ultimately, it's important to emphasize with one another that your goal is the same. You all want what's best for the loved one. But where you might need to negotiate is who takes on the different roles, responsibilities, and ways to move forward. Another example of a story of a family that I've worked with is three siblings and two daughters and a son. And the mom, who's 87 years old, who's currently in a nursing home. And in the beginning, there was a lot of discussion about who should take on whichever role. And it was hard. They weren't all in total agreement, but they ultimately decided to move forward in such a way that they each took on a responsibility that they felt was their strongest card. So specifically, the son felt that his talent was in managing the money. So he ensures that bills are paid and that there continues to be sufficient funds for paying for the nursing home. And the daughters, their strength was or continues to be in that emotional connection with their mother. And they also live that much closer. So they'll continue to drop in, make sure that the mom gets the needed support. But there was an element of negotiation and sort of a coming to agreement about who is going to take on whichever role. Now, when there is conflict, I remind people to apply some good old practices, which are pretty basic. Make sure you're listening and give feedback to make sure that you've really heard and understood each other. Also, try to demonstrate empathy and flexibility because things are constantly evolving as you continue to support an older loved one. Ultimately, however, I will acknowledge that for some caregivers, they decide that trying to involve their siblings or any other potential support person in the team is just simply too contentious. And so they simply find that it's less stressful to go it alone. But still, in this scenario, I encourage the caregiver to do a simple update by email, for example, about what is going on. So in this way that if and when the others are able to step in and provide support, they have a sense of what's being going on and they have a better sense of how they can step in and provide some support. Now, managing your stress, ultimately it comes back to who you are and what resonates with you in terms of managing stress. So, for example, with myself, I am someone that if I get stressed out, I need to go for a walk. I need to just burn off that energy and that stress. My husband, on the other hand, is someone who takes a nap. So we are each very different in terms of how we manage our stress. But on this slide here, you see a whole list of pretty self-explanatory ways of managing stress. But I, I think it's still helpful for people to really read through them, really sort of think, I hadn't really thought of that one for a while. Or I haven't ever tried that one for ever. I don't know if any of you, when you get stressed out and if you're in the car and you yell it out, I've heard that from some caregivers. I've heard some people talk about, a way of distracting themselves is just vegging out in front of the TV. And as you see here on this list, I put vegging out in front of the TV is okay. And the reason because of that is because in one of my caregiver support groups, when we discussed ways of managing our stress, this gentleman talked about how he felt guilty because he was sitting there vegging out in front of the TV. And my point to him was that's okay. If it's something that works for you and it gives you a way to sort of distract yourself or to move your thoughts and your fears and your worries away from the topic at hand, that's what you need. And it doesn't matter what it is. For those of us who have had children, walking away, just getting away from that, from possibly the behavioral challenges that you're dealing with your loved one who has some form of dementia can be critical. And you really need to pay attention to that. If you're getting to a boiling point, you have to remove yourself for a couple of minutes so you can just get a chance to get back down to earth again. As much as you can, outsourcing, trying to allocate responsibilities is to others is really a must. And again, as as I acknowledged earlier, that can be hard for some people. They feel it's just easier to do it on their own. And for some people, there's also an element of embarrassment. They're embarrassed to bring a neighbor over because they don't want the neighbor to see the outbursts in their loved one who has some form of dementia. They're sometimes just explaining to someone who doesn't understand the disease can minimize that embarrassment. But really, we have to be creative in terms of how we pull resources to us. The one thing that I really endorse beyond all of these is the caregiver support groups. I don't know how many of you have tried caregiver support groups, but I really give them a thumbs up. They are incredibly helpful in making you feel that you're not alone. You're hearing other people talk and express thoughts and feelings that you yourself are feeling and ways of reacting. So they provide a tremendous emotional support, but also they are incredibly helpful in terms of getting ideas and getting, people talk about, well, when my loved one does this, I do this. So they provide tremendous tricks of the trade. So for those of you who have not attended a caregiver support group, I would encourage you to at least try it out. You'll find often senior centers and councils on aging have these support groups, and they are free. On this slide here is just some very specific techniques, and I pulled it from the Springwell source. Springwell is an area agency on aging, and they provide a lot of resources to caregivers in the greater Boston area. Of course, I'm not sure where you live, but Springwell may be your local area agency on aging. If you haven't looked at them, or find out what area agency on aging that you live in, find out what kind of resources they have. They can be incredibly helpful. Now I'm going to hone in on specifically on services and resources that are available to caregivers. And the whole point is that they're there to give you a break, also known as respite. And you can arrange and set up these services in any way, shape, or form you want for several hours, several days of the week. That combination is really up to you. And services can come into the home, or services can be provided outside the home. So here first you see some great services that can come into the home, such as a home health care, which is more medical in nature, and a home care or personal care assistant, which is non-medical in nature, and then companionship. And if your loved one is someone who seeks more that opportunity for some engagement, then a companion can be invaluable. we have all come to realize how important social engagement is for us. And there's more and more research out there showing that social connections are also vital for people with dementias, especially in the early stages and the middle stages of dementia. So companionship is definitely something worth investing in. There are also services, as you can see here, outside the home. There are memory cafes, there are adult day centers, and then also skilled nursing facilities. Adult day centers are a really remarkable opportunity in that you can have your loved one go to a place, they stay there for 5 or 6 hours. They're engaged through activities, meals are provided, and you can see that different levels of engagement exists. Adult day social care is for high functioning older adults. Adult day healthcare is for people with some chronic condition where they need some sort of assistance. And then there's also dementia daycare. And for some of you, you may already have tried some of these, and it will be interesting afterwards when we talk. If you wanted to share a few of your own experiences with some of these services and resources in terms of what you may have found helpful. Many people, when they decide to hire help for a loved one in the home, I find that often people are pretty unsure how to go about hiring an aide. And I found that many people describe how they have to go through multiple attempts to get the right hire. And that is probably because in the beginning, you may not be finding this most suitable person for you yourself, or more importantly, for your loved one. It may also be because the agency is not the best choice and that you'll need to find another one. And I would say that the latter is true. If you find that the agency is just simply not able to respond to your specific requests or asks. In other words, they just don't seem to really be able to work with your specific needs for your loved one. But also, in terms of getting hopefully a good aide to come in right from the word get-go, I think sometimes people make the mistake of not really thinking through clearly what questions to ask. And I would say that these questions come in two domains. Most importantly, about who is the client, as in who is your loved one? What are their needs? What are their interests? Or any specific things that you think a particular kind of aid could support. But also think a little bit about the type of person that you yourself work best with. And what I mean by that is some of us want to have the person who's assisting us to come and ask with every step, do you want me to give more food? Do you want me to take them outside now? Do you want me to read to them now? So they're really checking in with you all the time. Whereas with other people, they're more hands off and they want someone who can think on their own 2 feet and only reach out to you if there's a specific, need or question. So thinking through those two domains, I would say, can sometimes be helpful in order to make sure that you get a better fit in terms of the aid. On this slide here, you have some questions that I find can be helpful. But again, it's all about trying to understand who they are, the aid, what their experience is, what their personality type is when there is an emergency, why they want to do the work that they're doing, and clearly, obviously, references and background check. References and background check is not relevant if they're getting them through an agency because they will already have done all the background checks. But if you're getting someone from the internet, such as Nextdoor or something like that, it's on you to really make sure that you've done some good uh, background checks. But I hope that, once you have a chance to review these questions, that these will be helpful if you're at a point where you're thinking or need to hire a new person. Now, I cannot stress enough how important it is to really consider that the emotional strain that you as the caregiver might be under. And not only in terms of what can you do yourself in terms of reducing your stress level and what you yourself can do in making use of resources in your community. But I also think that reaching out for help from others can be helpful. And I would argue there are actually quite a few avenues that we can consider. Family often comes to mind first, but friends and neighbors. And I will say that we are living in a different world than we did 50 years ago. Friends and neighbors become our extended family. So if you have a good relationship with your neighbors, with friends, let them know how you're doing. Let them know how they might be able to provide some support. And what I find is that often you have to be very concrete around where help is needed. In the beginning, when you're sort of taking on the caregiving role, you'll often hear people say, "Oh, let me know if I can be of any help." And where you need to be concrete is that you then need to say to them, "Thank you. I need help with," and then specify. That is not only tremendously helpful for them, because it's hard for them to really understand the situation you're in, but also you get what needs you may have really met. So, for example, if you could have someone who goes food shopping, they could buy a few things for you every so often. That could be enormous um, relief for you in terms of unburdening you with whatever role, an additional task that you may need to take on. There's also some important online resources that are so specifically geared towards people supporting an older loved one with either Alzheimer's specifically or any other kind of dementia. Facebook has a support group that some people like to use. But other than that, as I indicated, your Council on Aging, your senior center will have, some of them do have specific support groups for people caring for a loved one with dementia. The Family Caregiver Alliance has many different types of support groups, and again, some are specifically geared for dementia caregivers. All right, so finally, here you see a slide where I'm hoping to help you try to get you to a better place in terms of how you're coping in your role as a caregiver. And it requires that you think a little bit about what are your biggest challenges. Really label it and then you might be better able to work on it. And I've heard many people say that they're feeling stretched in terms of their continued demands from their loved one, as well as from other parts of their life, such as the family and work. And others will say that they're really having a hard time accepting seeing their parent or loved one becoming increasingly frail and forgetful. And this can make you feel tremendously powerless and vulnerable. Others, their biggest challenge is how to deal with family members. So again, whatever the situation or challenge, it's really important that you can really figure it out and label it. because I think once you are able to label it, it gives you an opportunity to work on it. And that might involve seeking professional counseling. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be tremendously helpful for the individual who is having a hard time dealing with this stage of life. Others want to reach out to a family member or friend, or as I listed, the many different services and resources. It's also important to recognize that what is most important for you and your loved one. And here I would argue that ultimately time is meaningful. And one really wonderful tool is reminiscence. It gives you an opportunity to review and discuss past experiences. And obviously, this is something that with your loved one, as their memory is going, the earlier you can do this, time is really critical here. I can certainly say that with my own mom, who passed away 13 years ago, I do wish that I'd had more conversations about events that only she would have had the answer to. And then finally, you need to really come to figure out what works for you in terms of de-stressing techniques. And what in conversations that I've had with many caregivers, sometimes people will say to me, I go for a walk. And I've been doing it for years whenever I was stressed out about job or whatever. But I find it's just not working anymore. I'm still preoccupied with the stress of what's going on for me as the caregiver. And sometimes you need to switch up those de-stressing coping mechanisms that you have been using for some time and try something new. Because ultimately you want to do something that distracts you and relaxes you. So again, sometimes just try something new. And finally, please recognize that this is a phase of your life which may require some adjustment and acceptance. And that can take some time to get to that point of acceptance. Okay. Thank you so much for listening.